It was the second Tuesday of October 1972, cold enough that the gravel outside the Coleman County Veterinary Clinic still held the night's frost in its shadowed corners, when 25-year-old Louise Kirby knelt down in that gravel with her knees soaking through her jeans and looked into the eyes of a dog who, 1 hour earlier, had still had 4 legs to stand on. His name was Scout. He was 8 years old, black and tan, one ear torn ragged from some old dispute nobody living remembered the particulars of anymore, and a hay baler chain in the equipment shed had caught his front leg wrong that morning, fast and clean and final, the way accidents on a working farm always seem to happen, not in the moment you're braced for trouble, but in the ordinary 5 minutes you'd stopped paying attention. Roy Pruitt had been stitching up the county's animals for 30 years, long enough to own a particular flattened voice men reach for when they've already decided a conversation is finished before it starts. And he used it now, standing over her with his forearms crossed and his sleeves still damp to the elbow. "Louise, I know this dog was your daddy's, and I know what that means to you. I do. But a cattle dog with 3 legs isn't a cattle dog anymore. He's a chore you feed twice a day and get nothing back from. The kindest thing you can do for him, and for yourself, is let me finish this clean, right now, before he wakes up hurting worse than he already is." She kept her palm flat against Scout's chest and felt his heart hammering under it, fast and frightened. Then, slowly, settling into something calmer, the way a spooked animal quiets once it finally understands it isn't going to be hurt again. She didn't answer Pruitt right away. She was thinking, in the strange sideways way grief and decision tangle together when you're 25, and burying your father is still closer behind you than in front, of his hands on this same dog's ears when Scout was a pup barely weaned, and her grandfather's hands before that on some other dog, some other porch, some other version of this exact conversation that had apparently been happening in her family for 3 generations without ever once ending the same way Roy Pruitt wanted it to end today. "He'll heal," she said. "He'll heal into a dog that can't work." Pruitt's voice had an edge of real frustration in it now. The frustration of a practical man watching what he considered a mistake happen in slow motion in front of him. "And a dog that can't work is a dog you're feeding for nothing, Louise, out here on a place that can't afford to feed anything for nothing." "He was my daddy's dog before he was mine," she said, and that was the whole of it. She didn't raise her voice to make the sentence carry more weight. She let the sentence carry its own weight, the way true things do. And then she lifted Scout into the bed of her truck herself, wrapped tight in an old wool blanket that still held some ghost of her father's pipe tobacco in its fibers, and drove the 11 miles home without another word to anyone, because arguing had never once been the shape Louise Kirby's convictions took. Her convictions took the shape of simply doing the thing and letting time prove out whether she'd been right. By the time the story crossed the 11 miles back into town, and every story in a county that size eventually made that crossing, one way or another, it had already been sanded down into something smaller and easier to laugh at, and it reached Delbert Ray standing at the feed bins on a Thursday morning, which meant within the hour it belonged to everyone in earshot whether they'd asked to hear it or not. Delbert had the build of a man whose money started doing more of his work than his own back did anymore. Broad through the shoulders, going soft now through the middle, dressed that morning in a denim jacket still holding the fold creases from the store shelf, a silver belt buckle the size of a closed fist catching the light every single time he shifted his weight, which he did often and on purpose, because Delbert Ray was a man who had never once in his life wanted to go unnoticed in a room. "Here, the Kirby girl's keeping herself a 3-legged dog now," he said, pitched loud enough that the comment was never really meant for just the one man beside him. "First she's out there running her daddy's whole outfit alone, and now she's nursing along a cripple that can't even herd a chicken across a hen house. That's not sentiment, boys. That's just bad management wearing a soft heart for a coat." He laughed at his own line, and the men around the bins laughed with him. Not because it was especially funny, but because that was the transaction Delbert Ray had always quietly offered a room. Laugh along, and you were one of the ones who understood how the world actually worked. Stay quiet, and you were the next thing he'd find to talk about. Louise heard it 2 days later from the woman at the feed store register, who told her gently, in the voice people use for news they suspect will sting but think a person ought to hear anyway, rather than be the last to know. Louise only nodded and thanked her for the flour and carried it out to the truck, because she had never once in her life gone looking for Delbert Ray to set him straight, and she wasn't going to start now over a joke that would stop mattering to everyone the moment something else came along to replace it. To Louise, power had never looked like a public argument won. It looked like a thing done quietly, in the cold, before dawn, with nobody watching, and proven true only much later, long after the people who'd laughed had forgotten they ever had a reason to. Back home in the loose sandy dirt behind the house, Scout was already trying to stand. He went down hard the first time, his weight tipping wrong onto the side where the leg used to be, catching himself against nothing at all and hitting the dirt shoulder first with a small grunt that made Louise's own chest ache to hear. She crouched a few feet off and made herself watch instead of rushing in to help, because some old instinct passed down from her grandfather told her that catching him too soon would only teach him to expect being caught. And a dog that expected to be caught his whole life wasn't a dog that would ever learn to stand on his own again. He went down a second time the same way. On the third try, he held for 4 full seconds, trembling, before his balance gave out from under him again. On the 5th try, he stood and stayed standing, swaying only slightly, the stump held up and tucked against his chest. And he turned his head and looked over at her with the exact same steady, waiting expression he'd always worn his whole life, not asking to be pitied, only asking what needed watching now. Watching him, she thought of her grandfather, Everett Kirby, gone 2 years before her own father followed him, who still lived inside her the particular way people do when they've taught you nearly everything with their hands instead of their mouths. She could see him clearly if she let her eyes go soft. A winter evening years back, working saddle leather at the kitchen table under the one good lamp, the owl and the waxed thread moving steady and unhurried between his fingers, while he talked without ever once looking up from the stitching. "You know what makes a good dog, Louise girl?" She'd been maybe 9, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a barn cat in her lap, only half listening the way children do until the exact moment a sentence turns out to matter for the rest of their lives. Everybody thinks it's legs, speed, how quick he can turn a runaway steer before it clears the fence line. But I've known fast dogs, pretty dogs, dogs that took every blue ribbon the county fair had to give out, that couldn't tell you a storm was coming if it was already raining straight down on their own fool heads. He held the leather up close to the lamplight, checked the stitch line with his thumbnail, set it back down without hurry. A dog that's lost something usually finds himself another way of looking at the world to make up for it. That's not a smaller kind of dog, girl. That's just a different kind of eyes than the rest of them have got. She hadn't understood it then. At 9 years old, she had only wanted to know whether the dog and whatever story he was working toward got to keep on living. She understood it now, an inch at a time. Every single morning, Scout dragged himself upright in that yard and simply refused to stay down in it. By November, he'd worked out a slow, rolling gait along the fence line that favored his right side, and Louise had long since expected him to work the herd the way he used to. No more cutting a steer clean from the pack, no more nipping low at heels to turn a line of cattle toward the loading chute, the way he'd done since he was barely a year old. She worked more from horseback now, and mostly let Scout sit near the gate posts while she did, which didn't look like a single useful thing in the world if you happened to be the kind of man who judged a dog only by what he could still outrun. The first time she noticed anything had changed in him, it wasn't anything she could have explained out loud to Roy Pruitt or to Delbert Ray or to a single soul in the county who hadn't spent a whole life learning to read the particular language written in an animal's stillness. It was a Tuesday, near the end of November, cold enough that her breath hung fogged in front of her face at 5 in the morning, and Scout was already standing at the fence rail when she came out the door, which he hadn't in weeks, not since the accident, usually waiting instead by the porch step to be called along. His ears were up and forward. His whole body had drawn taut and pointed, the way a compass needle draws toward north whether it wants to or not, fixed on a heifer grazing near the back corner of the pasture. She almost waved it off entirely. The heifer looked, to her own tired eye, exactly like every other heifer scattered across that pasture. Head down, grazing, giving off no sign whatsoever that anything in her was wrong. Louise stood there a long moment in the cold, genuinely unsure whether she was reading meaning into an old injured dog simply staring off to nothing, the particular kind of foolishness grief sometimes talks a person into, wanting signs to exist in a world that had stopped handing her many. But her grandfather's voice came back to her out of the cold morning air, a different kind of eyes, and instead of turning back toward the porch, she walked out across the frozen ground to check the animal herself, half expecting, even as she walked, to find nothing at all and feel foolish for having bothered. Up close, the heifer's eyes carried a shade less shine in them than they should have. Her breathing, when Louise laid her bare hand flat against her flank, came a fraction too quick. So faint a difference that for a long moment Louise genuinely doubted her own hand, doubted whether she was feeling something real or only feeling what 3 sleepless nights and a dead father's absence had put into her head. She stood there with her palm against that animal's warm side for what felt like a long time, caught between turning back toward the house and something quieter in her that wouldn't let her walk away just yet. By the next morning, there was no more room left for doubting anything. The heifer was favoring one leg entirely, hot to the touch with fever, the swelling already deep and low in the muscle in exactly the way it sits before anyone thinking in ordinary terms would even consider the word blackleg. Louise had her separated from the herd within the hour, had Pruitt on the phone before her coffee had gone cold, and had the antibiotic regimen started before the infection had a single extra day to travel further through muscle tissue than it already had. Pruitt, out treating the animal that afternoon, glanced over at Scout lying quiet near the barn door and said it almost to himself, the way a man says a thing he hadn't fully meant to say out loud. "Huh, got that early." "Scout caught it early," Louise said, not looking up from where she was holding the heifer steady. "I just decided to believe him instead of my own eyes." Pruitt didn't have a great deal to offer in answer to that, but for the first time since October, he didn't argue with her either. And coming from a man like Pruitt, that silence was its own kind of quiet surrender. It happened again in December, though this time it wasn't sickness working its way through the herd. Coleman County had settled hard into one of the bitterest winters in a decade, the kind of cold that pushes coyotes down out of the brush country and closer to cattle they'd ordinarily have left well enough alone, because the rabbits and ground squirrels they lived on most winters had gone thin and scarce with the deep freeze. Scout started waking her at strange hours of the night, standing rigid at the foot of her bed or braced at the window, a low sound caught somewhere in his throat that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a growl, something lower and more careful than either. The first 2 nights she pulled on her boots and checked and found nothing waiting for her but frozen ground and hard stars, and by the second night she'd nearly convinced herself she was letting an old, restless, injured dog cost her sleep she'd badly needed for nothing at all. The third night, she found fresh coyote tracks circling tight around the low pasture where she kept a handful of cows close to calving, and a fence post gnawed low at its base, patient and testing, exactly where the wire had the most give in it. She moved the herd in tighter that same week, strung an extra line of wire along the weak stretch, started sleeping with the rifle propped by the door instead of locked away in the closet where it had sat untouched since her father's passing. Scout woke her 4 more times that month, and 4 more times she pulled her boots on in the dark and walked out into the cold and found sign, fresh and undeniable, that something had come closer to her herd than it had any business coming. Have you ever kept faith with something the whole world had already told you plainly to give up on, not because you had a single shred of proof yet that you were right to keep it, but because some old, stubborn, entirely unglamorous part of you simply refused to believe a living thing was finished being useful just because it had stopped looking, to everyone else's eyes, the way useful things were supposed to look? Louise never once put the question to herself in those words. She was too busy walking fence lines at 5 in the morning in weather that punished the walking, too busy sleeping in broken pieces between one coyote call and the next, too tired most nights to think in anything but the plainest terms of what needed doing before daylight. But the question lived underneath everything she did that whole winter all the same, underneath every choice to trust a three-legged dog's judgment over the faster, prettier, better-bred animals the rest of the county had always sworn by, without ever once having to test that faith the way she was testing hers now. By January, the black leg working its way through scattered pockets of the county had become the only thing worth discussing at the co-op, spreading the way these things do once a hard winter has already worn a whole population thin at the edges, moving first through one rancher's herd, then a neighbor's, carried along shared water troughs and shared pasture fence before anyone had thought to catch it early enough to stop its path. Delbert Ray, who had expanded his herd that year on the strength of his new machinery and his growing name around the county, didn't notice a thing was wrong until his hired hand found the first animal down and unable to rise in the frozen mud one gray morning, and by the time anyone thought to look harder at the rest of the herd, 3 more were already too far along to be saved by anything Pruitt could offer them. He lost 11 head of cattle before January had finished with him. The coyotes took more from him still. A brutal cold snap in the last week of the month drove predator activity to levels the oldest ranchers in the county swore they hadn't witnessed since before the war, and Delbert's operation, larger now and spread thinner across more acreage than any one man could watch closely through a winter like that, lost 4 calves inside a single week, found each cold morning half buried in frost, the story already written plainly enough in the disturbed ground that nobody needed a single word of it explained further. Louise lost nothing, not one animal sick or taken the entire winter through. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't some kind of grace she'd been handed and Delbert hadn't. It was a 3-legged dog who noticed a fever a full day before it ever became a visible limp, who woke a tired woman from a hard-earned sleep before a shadow at the fence line ever became a kill, and it was that same woman willing to pull her boots on in the freezing dark 4 separate nights running on nothing firmer than her dog's word that something out there wasn't right. Word of it traveled through Coleman County the same way word of the crippled dog had traveled back in October, except this time nobody standing around the co-op was laughing about any of it. By February, ranchers who had never once exchanged more than a passing nod with Louise Kirby were pulling their trucks up along her fence line at odd hours, asking her in the careful, half-embarrassed way grown men ask for things they'd rather not have to ask for at all, how in the world she'd come through a winter like this one, with her whole herd standing upright when half the county was still out there counting up what they'd lost to fever and to teeth. She told each one of them plainly, without a trace of triumph anywhere in her voice, because there was none in her left to give after a winter like that. I listen to my dog. He sees things a good deal earlier than I do. Some of them nodded like they understood exactly what she meant by it. Some of them only looked over at Scout, lying stretched out by the gatepost in the thin winter sun on his 3 legs, and didn't say a single word back to her at all, and their silence said the rest of what needed saying for them. Delbert Ray came to her gate himself on a Thursday morning in early March, driving that same second tractor that had sat dead in his yard half the winter because he'd been too consumed keeping what remained of his herd alive to think once about its battery. He didn't have a great deal to say once he got there. He stood at the fence a while with his hat in his hands, looked out past her at Scout, looked past the dog to her cattle grazing calm and whole and entirely unbothered in the near pasture, and finally said it, quiet enough that it barely carried the short distance between them. "Guess I owe that dog of yours an apology." Louise didn't gloat over him. She never had that particular meanness in her, not even now. Not even after everything he'd said about her at those feed bins back in October. He wouldn't know the first thing to do with an apology, she said. Just don't go selling your own good dogs short next time on account of how they happen to look written down on paper. Delbert nodded once, settled his hat back on, and drove off down the road. And that turned out to be the very last conversation anyone in Coleman County ever needed to have about any of it, because by then the whole story had already finished telling itself the plain way true things eventually do, without a bit of help from anybody standing around to argue the point. Scout lived 4 more slow years after that hard winter, a little quieter and a little grayer with each one that passed, until the spring finally came when Louise buried him beneath the same old oak tree where her father and her grandfather before him were both laid to rest, on a stretch of ground that had never once in 3 generations been worth farming, and had, for exactly that reason, always been kept sacred instead of plowed. She kept his collar afterward, cracked leather gone soft with age, the buckle worn smooth as river stone under 1,000 fastenings, in the top drawer of her father's old dresser, laid beside her grandfather's leatherworking owl, 2 small, unremarkable, ordinary objects holding between them an entire lifetime's philosophy about what deserved to be trusted in this world and what never really had. 40 years from that winter, Louise's granddaughter, home from college that summer and going slowly through the house after Louise herself had finally passed, found the collar and the awl together in that same drawer, exactly where they'd rested undisturbed for 4 decades, and asked her grandmother's oldest living neighbor, standing at the fence the way old men in that county always seemed to, what the 2 things together were supposed to mean. He told her, unhurried, the way old men tell you the stories that have mattered to them the longest, about a 3-legged dog who'd seen what nobody else in the whole county could see coming, and about a woman who had never once in her life needed the rest of the world's permission before she trusted what she already knew, plain and certain, in her own 2 hands. That same summer, without a single moment's hesitation, the family brought home a rescue dog from the county shelter, an older animal, half-blind in one eye, the exact kind of dog nobody else standing in that shelter that day had wanted to take a chance on. Louise's granddaughter didn't need to think it over even for a moment. She'd heard the story often enough across her whole life to know precisely what kind of eyes she was looking for. If you'd like more stories like Louise and Scout's, stories about the people who saw worth where everyone else saw waste, subscribe to FarmLore. There's more waiting for you here.